Eli, philosophical question for you. Does more unite us or divide us?
This is a very generalizing question. I
No,
mean,
Hypatia tells us the answer.
well, yes, obviously it's like more things that unite us because A plus B equals C or something like that.
Yeah, if A equals B, then it all... Well, no, yes. More things unite us than divide us.
Yes, naturally. Of course.
Like podcasts. Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
And I'm Elijah Fleming.
And today we're talking about Agora, or Agora.
Depends.
Yeah, depends. A 2009 historical drama directed by Alejandro Amenabar, starring Rachel Weisz and Oscar Isaac, about Hypatia, a philosopher who lived in Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th century CE. So, Leo, Jesus. Leo, did you dig this movie? Look at this boy. I need to put a picture of him.
Obviously digs this movie.
Leo is my cat, by the way. Leo digs anytime I watch movies because if I'm on my couch, that's his favorite thing, just being either next to me or on me when I'm on the couch. But Eli, you were the one that recommended this movie to me. I had never heard of it, but what do you...
Yeah, I had never seen this movie. I just knew that it existed, and it was always sort of on my list and never kind of got around to seeing it. But I think I kind of dug this movie. It was trying to do a lot of things, and I'm still kind of like processing.
Yeah.
And I feel like it didn't maybe succeed in all of the things it was trying to do, but I think it's definitely a different type of historical movie. Like it's not what I would call, like, it's not very action based, and there's no like big dramatic battles.
It's not really it's not a sword and sandal. It's like
yeah.
In that sense, like, well, there's sandals, but and there's swords, I guess, but it's not it's not like in the gladiator tradition, for example.
Exactly. And so I think I appreciated it just for its sort of the variety that it kind of expresses. It's something really different. And I think it does try to tackle like a lot of different themes. And like I said, I don't know if it really succeeds, but it was enjoyable and interesting to sort of think about the things that it kind of brought up.
Yeah. So you recommended this movie. I had never heard of this movie. It flew underneath my radar. I think it had a somewhat limited release.
Yeah, it seemed like it didn't really get a lot of attention at all.
No. Yeah. So I'm looking at its wiki right now. So it's interesting to note that it's an English language film starring American and British, primarily American and British actors. Some of the other actors are Israeli or Arab Israeli or Egyptian Israeli. But it's a Spanish film in English. It was made in Spain. It debuted at Cannes in 2009, but it couldn't really find a domestic distributor. So it wasn't really distributed in the United States. It opened in Spain and actually did really well in Spain, box office wise, but it had a very limited release in the US. So that's like part of the reason we had never heard of it, because there might have not really been any way to watch it. And I should say for the listeners, it's on Amazon. So like we're probably going to get into a lot of spoilers.
Yeah.
So if you haven't seen this movie and you want to see this movie before we get, I mean, you kind of know it's one of those. It's one of those movies like the joke is like you could spoil Titanic being like, well, the ship sinks.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we are going to get into spoilers. But it is available if you have an Amazon Prime. You can just watch it for free on Amazon. That's how I watched it.
Same.
Yeah, it's about a 2-hour movie, so that was a welcome change of pace.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but yeah, I agree. I think there's things I liked about it. When I went into this movie, it's not a perfect movie, but I don't think it's a bad movie.
Yeah.
And when I was kind of going into this movie, I had like two questions sort of early on, knowing its subject matter, which, as we'll get into, is about a pagan philosopher named Hypatia, who is killed by a Christian mob during this sort of era of religious strife towards the sort of latter end of the Roman Empire. I had two questions kind of going into this film. The first is, considering, the other films about like religion and religious strife in the ancient world that we've watched so far, is this a sort of, is this movie's approach going to be sort of nuanced and maybe thoughtful, or is it going to be a sort of polemic by one side or the other,
Right,
or
right.
against one side or the other? And then my second question is, why is this film called Agora?
Okay, yes, that was also my question. I'm like, why are we calling it this?
It,
I thought maybe because like in the beginning, like there's a lot of the confrontations that sort of happen in the big,
yeah,
marketplace that we would maybe call an agora, and it's like, but
it's
like
like the
that's not where
marketplace of
everything
ideas.
happens.
Like, I don't know what's going on. Like, yeah, because the Agora, like, you're right. Like, in the beginning, I'm like, all right, like, maybe, like, the Agora, it's, like, almost going to be, like, a play, and, like, the Agora is, like, the scene where, like, everything kind of happened, everything
Yeah,
goes down in the Agora, but it doesn't really. Like,
it
I feel like
doesn't.
a better title would have been, like, Hypatia, or even, like, Alexandria, or something like that. Or
Yes,
some
yeah.
other, I don't know. It feels like the title Agora was like, maybe it was like nobody could agree on the title for the film, and this was like everybody's fourth choice.
So that's what the one
Yeah,
everybody
because
like
it,
compromised
it
with.
neither it describe it tells me like nothing about the movie, and like
Mm-mm.
I don't know, for whatever reason, before I knew what this movie about, I thought it was going to be about something completely different. Like, because when you first told me about this movie, and it's like a movie called Agora and it's starring Rachel Weisz, and I saw like a picture of it, and I was like, oh, maybe it's about like classical Athens and it's some sort of like drama romance or something like that.
Hmm.
And then I'm like, oh no, it's
Yeah.
about Hypatia of Alexandria, and it's like a sort of pseudo
Yeah.
religious film.
Yeah, it's not at all descriptive, and it was kind of confusing, and I remember reading just, like, through the description, like, on IMDb or something, and really thinking about your first question on how is this movie going to treat
Hmm.
different religions, and I really thought it was going one direction sort of in the
Hmm.
beginning, with a lot of the Christian determinism that we've seen
Hmm.
before. Even from, like, the little intro, the words on the screen that was like, "And the rising new Christianity,"
Hmm.
it sort of felt very prophetic,
Hmm.
I guess. But then it sort of like did a 180,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I've Some of the reviews I feel like are mad at the representation of
Hmm.
Christianity in this
Yeah,
movie. And I think that's
I
interesting.
watched like a 7-minute YouTube video by a bishop where he's just railing against this
Oh,
movie,
oh my gosh.
which I like got angry just watching it because
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of made a little bit. I thought that argument was made a little bit in bad faith, because I don't think this movie is like, he frames, and I think people frame this movie as being anti-Christian. And I mean, very often when I hear complaints like that, like, sort of my thought is like, did you watch this film? Because I mean,
Yeah.
I think if
Yeah.
anything, this film is anti-fundamentalist, which
Yes.
shouldn't necessarily, I mean, it is not a particularly polemic position to take.
No, no. But it's like nobody in this movie comes off very
No,
well
it doesn't, because like
at
I thought
all.
it was, so there's, I'm getting ahead of myself, but like this movie sort of, it sets itself up a little bit. This is actually one of my, the problem I think with the narrative of the film, is that it sort of becomes like, like you're right. Like, I thought it was going to be one movie about maybe like
Mhm.
this, like sort of almost like a feminist, like this woman who is ahead of her time but is sort of constrained by the culture and the society she's born into. It's not really that,
It's
because no
not.
one
Yeah.
really, like, everyone's like really on board with Hypatia for the most part, with the
Yeah.
exception of the antagonist Cyril and his
Yeah.
followers. And then it becomes a sort of Galileo story, but it's
Mhm.
also kind of not really a Galileo. Like, it's trying to force Hypatia into a Galileo mold that I want to get into in a little
Yeah.
bit. But like, to the first point, because it's not that the Christians are necessarily all the way across the board, like, sort of knuckle dragging Philistines who just want to destroy. Like, they do destroy the library and all the censors of learning, and are sort of, are responsible for sort of aggravating religious turmoil and civil strife in
Yeah.
Alexandria, and are
Mhm.
responsible for destroying the sort of great center of learning. We should probably backtrack a little bit and maybe describe the plot in a second, but
Yeah.
they're not, as we're like getting at, yeah, we're building this argument backwards, but
We
they're
are.
also like shown with like a some degree, like there's a scene where like they're shown to, like, they're giving alms to the poor, of like,
Yeah.
and like it kind of, I think the movie does, I think, a fairly reasonable job sort of explaining like why this religion appealed to so many people in the time that
For
it
sure.
did. Because the pagans
Yeah.
themselves are not even like, they're not particularly enlightened either. Like, they're also kind of
No.
dogmatic, and they're very
Exactly.
elitist.
Yeah, and they obviously, like, care a lot about certain things, but have this blind eye toward, like, human suffering right in front of
Hmm.
them. I think that
They're
was
sort of
that's something
cloistered
that
in their
really.
with their books and their learning and
Yeah,
their
and
privilege.
they're so freaked out, when they're, like, trying to get all of the scrolls to, like, run out of the temple, and they're just, being horrible to the slaves who are also running, who are also, in danger of being
Hmm.
slaughtered, and yeah, it's just this sort of they're also not coming off well. They're caring more about, what's written on the papyrus versus, like, the human lives, and yeah, so
So
but we are kinda going
yeah,
backward.
so to backtrack for those who probably haven't, which is many people who haven't seen this movie yet, and I feel like there's many even in our own field who like have maybe this movie exists on the fringes of our knowledge, but it's like, oh, you should see that at one point.
Yeah.
So hopefully, if anything, this
Yeah.
podcast gets you to see the movie, so you can realize that while we're doing a great job criticize or reviewing this film, or we're just totally off our rockers. But the general
Yeah.
plot is it's based on a real historical figure, Hypatia, who you also might recognize Hypatia if you watch The Good Place. She's played by Lisa Kudrow in the final season. Have you seen The Good Place?
No, I've only watched, like, the first season.
Oh, well, Hypatia of Alexandria shows up in the last couple episodes, and it's Lisa Kudrow.
That's awesome.
She goes by Patty, but
Naturally.
Hypatia of Alexandria, because there's a funny bit to spoil something where like in the last season of The Good Place, they get to the good place and then they find out that there's something wrong there. But as they're going into the good place, Chidi, he's like, "Oh, are all my favorite philosophers going to be here?" And he's like, "Aristotle," and then what's her name, Janice is like, "Nope, like he's not here. Advocated for slavery." And he's like, "Plato," he's like, "Nope, the slavery thing." And then he lists a bunch of philosophers, like, "No, they're not here."
Yep, that
But
tracks.
Hypatia of Alexandria is in The Good Place. And she
Okay, alright.
was a real woman who lived
Mhm.
somewhere between 350 to, she was killed in 415. She was a philosopher and a mathematician and an astronomer. She taught students to sort of very well in the sort of intellectual political circles of the Roman Empire, particularly at this point where things in Europe are kind of as we say, the technical term in the business is going to shit. But in the East, because the empire is already split, I think this is the Honorius Theodosius split right now. So
Mhm.
the empire has been
Yep.
split between into two empires. In the East, things are relatively more stable and will continue to be for about 1,000 years. But
Yeah.
yeah, but she is caught up in this sort of political / religious strife between the prefect of the city of Alexandria in Egypt, Orestes, and Cyril, the bishop in Alexandria. And then eventually she is killed by a Christian mob, probably at the behest of Cyril, the bishop, who had gone on a large smear campaign against her, accusing her of witchcraft and heresy and other things. Or maybe not heresy.
Yep. Well, like satanic something something. Yeah.
So yeah, so that's the basic plot of the movie, which we basically follow Hypatia. And the movie, like I said, this movie kind of happens in two halves. The
Yeah.
first half is sort of the rise of these sort of Christian fundamentalists in the city, which culminates in the burning of, well, they frame it as the burning of the Library of Alexandria, which
Which
is not
is
really,
not really.
yeah. So the other context is, I don't even, do we
Yeah.
get into this?
Well, I mean, I don't know. They even kind of mention it at one point that they call the where they are the library like a daughter library and they
Hmm.
refer to a mother library and that like the actual Library of Alexandria had been like basically slowly declining and didn't exist anymore at this point in time.
It's a funny, like, almost like cultural myth. Like, I see it today. I will see memes that are like lamenting the burning of the Library of Alexandria. So,
Yeah.
the Library of Alexandria being after Alexander the Great, and in the successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies, they built this huge library where they collected all sorts of literature and technical learning and biology and math and geometry and all every kind of learning imaginable, and it was curated and edited and made copies, and it was this massive sort of intellectual center. It was the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. And then slowly, kind of, particularly after the Romans kind of began to decline, was disseminated. By the time of Hypatia, was not really an entity, although the building that she worked in, both in the film and in real life, is the Serapeion, which is a temple of Serapis, a sort of Greco-Egyptian god.
Super cool.
Which had sort of remnants of the library and was still like a large center of cultural learning. So the first half of the film culminates in basically the pagans in and around and associated with the Serapeion become increasingly frustrated with the sort of conflict with the Christians. They launch an attack on the streets against the Christians, who then retaliate and drive and basically massively outnumber the pagans, drive them back into the temple, and then the emperor has to intervene, and he decrees that the pagans can leave. They're pardoned, they can leave, but the temple and all the learning therein is going to be not ceded over. It has to be abandoned, and then the Christians go in, and then they sack the place. And then the second half is basically the conflict of the movie is basically jumps ahead a couple of years, and Hypatia is still teaching and living in the city, and her sort of the conflict with Orestes, the prefect, and Cyril, the bishop, which culminates in her death.
Yeah. I feel like this story could have been better told in like a mini series format.
Yeah. When I was watching it, one of my first reactions was sort of like, this feels like maybe the best produced History Channel special I've ever seen.
Yeah,
it has a little bit of that feel. Like, it does a lot of expositing.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like you said, it's sort of all over the place.
Yeah, and I would almost like argue that like Hypatia isn't like the most main character. I feel like it sort of also revolves around like the men who are sort of interwoven in her class and then in her life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the guy who becomes the bishop of Cyrene.
Yeah, Synesius,
who's like a Christian among the pagans in the beginning. And then Orestes, who becomes the prefect, which that's not historically accurate, but the bishop part was. I think he actually was her student.
Yes. And we have one of our main, so Hypatia, we actually have it's very murky about what we know about her. We have no actual work or writing about her. We only have other people writing about her, but we do have a couple of letters by this bishop, I think 7 or something like that, written by the bishop to her. We don't have any of her responses, but we do have some letters that he wrote to her.
Which is really cool.
Yeah.
And then her slave, the Davis, who joins the militant Christian mob and sort of like has this very like horrifying disillusionment almost with his actions, maybe. I feel like all of them didn't get like full arcs, and I feel like it could have been really cool to sort of see all of these different people like early on in their lives and how they connect to each other. And then later, when they have all of these huge political strings attached to them and like the choices that they have made. I loved the scene when Cyril wants all the dignitaries to like kneel before the Bible and Orestes won't do it. And you see between all of the men. So it's like the bishop and then Orestes and Davis out in the back. They all like have this like look. They're all the ones who have been like affected by her and sort of all of these choices that they've made. And that part I thought was really cool.
Yeah.
But it wasn't full. It didn't like have this complete storyline for me. I don't know.
There's so many, like, I have a lot of thoughts and like I'm trying to organize them in a coherent way for our listeners, because we're 20 minutes in. I feel like we're already like we've gone in 6 places.
I know.
But and like
so did this movie. So
yeah, any attempt I had at a roadmap like just fell apart 5 minutes into starting this episode.
I'm sorry, it's my fault.
No. It's we're complicit. We both betrayed Hypatia. Let's be honest.
We did, yeah.
But so one thing I think needs to be, let's start with Hypatia herself and Rachel Weisz. But
okay,
the one thing I think that needs to be said is this is a movie that is maybe setting itself up as almost a sort of feminist take, but this is a movie about a woman where there's only one woman.
Yeah.
Rachel Weisz is the only female character in this movie.
Yep.
And like, granted, she existed in a world that was dominated in real life. She would have been surrounded by men, but there is her and her alone. So, fails the Bechdel test, but Hypatia she's set up as I mean, part of it is I love Rachel Weisz, and I love pretty much
Oh yeah,
everything she's in. I think she's
she was
great.
great.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So she can kind of do no wrong. Hypatia, yeah. So, but Hypatia, they make, I think, a very conscious decision with Hypatia to make her into a basically proto Galileo, because the
Hmm.
whole throughout the movie, there's kind of two conflicts going on, as I see it. There is the sort of political religious conflict between the city and the political players and the bishop and the prefect and all that, and then there's Hypatia's sort of own personal conflict that she kind of is really more invested in herself because she's like, I just
Yeah.
want to like do my astronomy.
I just want to do my work.
Yeah. And so they really focus on her as like an astronomer, and they set up very early on the kind of geocentric Ptolemaic model where Earth is the center of the universe. And then throughout the movie, she comes to sort of realize that it's a heliocentric model, and she kind of figures out that the Earth isn't moving in a circle around the sun. It actually needs to be moving in an ellipsis. That's to explain the seasons.
Yeah.
And so that's like her sort of conflict, is her discovering this truth about the universe. But this
Yeah.
is where the movie
Which
just
didn't we have no basis for that actually
no.
happening, but I like it. I thought it was kind of fun. Yeah.
So yeah, like so like the two sort of maybe like gripe angles. I don't want to. Yeah, the two sort of gripe angles that I could come at it with is one on the pedantic history side, which is, well, like she was an astronomer, but it seems like her main work was more in math, or really she was a Neoplatonist, which the
Hmm.
movie doesn't get into at all, which I don't fault it for because that would be
No,
really
that's like a huge like barrel of snakes that nobody needs to jump in.
yes, but she was a proponent of a school of philosophy that was deeply influential on both Christian and pagan thinkers.
Hmm.
It's sort
Yeah.
of based on Plato, but it has to do with like truth. I don't even really understand Neoplatonism all that well myself.
No, it's like everybody, the entire universe is like heading into some sort of divine beat, like
Mm-hmm.
progress. Like there's always movement toward a divine. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and I think like the big contribution, if I remember correctly from my undergraduate days where I took late antiquity courses, I can say words, is it has to do with like the idea of like being like there's like truth and perfection and like a god or divine being like a more than perfect being, things like that.
Yeah.
But anyways, but yeah, she was a thinker in that school. My sort of narrative gripe about this movie is that in making her a Galileo figure, this movie I think kind of has a problem because like in a sort of quote unquote Galileo story, there's some sort of dichotomy. Like the conflict is over like person who is pursuing sort of something true or like wants to share some kind of knowledge or truth, and then a sort of authority embodied by the church or something like the church
Right.
wanting to sort of stifle that.
Yeah.
Like that's like
Hmm.
Golden Compass or something,
Yeah. No, exactly.
that kind of like that Galileo struggles, but like that. So you have this conflict where she's discovering something really sort of revolutionary and groundbreaking. I
Yeah.
think this movie is basically positing that she got onto this like 2,000 years before Galileo, or 1,000 years before Galileo.
Right, right, right. Yeah. But yeah, and then it sort of makes her death more powerful at that
Because we
moment.
stifled that knowledge. I guess I'm coming
Exactly.
around because my initial gripe was that it's not like anyone is actively trying to. No one's coming at her because of this heliocentric model
Right.
which you would see in like if this was a movie about Galileo or somebody like that. It
Exactly.
would be
Yeah.
like you can't publish this; it's heresy or whatever. That's not the conflict.
No.
And this movie doesn't. I mean, it's. I think it's right, but I think you're right. Now I sort of come around that it's like the tragedy is that this sort of is the idea of what we lost because of her death,
Hmm.
and like we don't know. We actually don't even know what we lost, but we can think, imagine.
Yeah.
So and I think Hypatia's are really good. So we talked in the Cleopatra episode, where Jeremy was saying how
Mm.
there's so many sort of women from history or ancient history that just get sort of forgotten because a very small number like Cleopatra and maybe a few others tend to suck up all the oxygen in the air.
Yeah.
And so Hypatia, I think, is a really great model for a dramatic subject like this, exactly because,
Definitely. Yeah.
and I think in the same way that we were talking about Spartacus, where we know very little about Spartacus,
Hmm.
but that also we know just enough to write a story, and then we can sort of fill in what we need to tell the story. And Hypatia is exactly like that, where we actually we know very little. We have an outline of her, but the inner.
Yeah. Yeah. I do feel like though that I wanted more. It's like I think it's great that she was like a very central figure in this story, but I feel like she also didn't feel like a completely full character. And I think there was so much time and attention in the male characters around her that I think was really great, and I liked a lot of that conflict. But I would have also been happy with more Hypatia.
I think, yeah, because we were saying how like this movie is kind of a couple of different movies, sort of
It is,
that
for
now
sure.
really, and like the very beginning. I think this is most clear in like the first, I guess, act you would call it, where there's this sort of, it almost seems like it's setting itself up as like a romantic
Yeah.
drama, where it's
Mhm.
like there's a slave who kind of is Davis the slave who's sort of pining after her, and the student Orestes played by Davis played by Max Mignala, Orestes, played by Oscar Isaac, who are kind of vying for her affection.
Mhm.
I read so there's a scene in the movie where, oh my god, first we could talk about the proposal scene.
It was so cringe. It was like,
Oh man,
I just need to like not be in this room. It was so
could you
terrible.
imagine? That was so awkward. So can you imagine like everybody's at the theater and Orestes during the intermission. Orestes, Oscar Isaac gets up with his flute, which by the way, the sound that instrument makes.
Was wild. It was like
Yes.
multiple tones.
Well,
Very
so
cool.
he's playing the owlus, like the double flute, and we started playing it, and it was like a reed. I didn't actually know, but I wanted to be like, that's not the sound it would make, but I actually don't know the sound it would make. So what do I know? And he plays like a solo on his flute, and then
Yep.
declares his love for his teacher,
It's
and
not
and
good.
the whole theater is like watching this, and her dad's right there, and she rebuffs him, and then oh man, that whole so the that Orestes being her student and being in love with her is purely fiction.
Right.
I'm not sure why this movie added the student thing. I don't know why it added that romantic subplot that goes nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just sort of to like, I guess, highlight the fact that like, because they do mention it. It's like if Hypatia gets married, she's not supposed to then keep being a philosopher and a teacher. She would then just be
Yeah,
a wife and a mother.
it would be her figurative death or her
Yeah,
spiritual death.
her career death, I
Yeah.
guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I mean that's I don't know. But yeah, it didn't really need to be there, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Except maybe like toward the end because Orestes is then still sort of that's his big like wedge is that he
Mm-hmm.
can't not like continue
He can't
to
renounce her, or he can't
yeah.
betray
Yeah.
her.
Yeah, he can't betray her in the end, I guess.
But anyway, yeah. So there's a cringe-inducing scene where he proposes to her and is rebuffed. But I did read that. So that story about where she basically gives him her like I don't know how to describe it.
Menstrual blood?
Yeah, like in a rag. Basically, she gives
Yeah.
him this like period blood rag, and she has this rebuff that's like you're in love with like the idea of me, basically, like the real me
Yeah.
you would find like much less appealing.
Much less appealing, yeah.
Yeah, which is a story that story is from ancient sources. It's not involving Orestes. It's some other student who proposed to
Was
her.
in love with her, yeah.
But that brings me to a sort of a thought: is Hypatia as this kind of like martyr almost? She's almost like a philosopher saint,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of an archetype
Yeah.
in the ancient world, where as sort of Christianity and Christian literature is sort of profligating, and you have all these stories of saints and their miracles, there actually is a sort of almost like sort of counter tradition, or you see writings like of sort of famous particularly philosophers like Apollonius of Tyana is like one of these, whereas like these almost like these like philosopher saints who go around like performing miracles or like
Yeah.
and like doing all sorts of amazing things. My favorite, I really only remember one story about Apollonius, but I gotta share it because it's awesome.
Yes, please.
Where like so he is one of his students gets engaged, and they're at the wedding, and then Apollonius of Tyana, the philosopher, realizes that the bride is in fact an impusa, which is like a vampire kind of creature. It's like a kind of monster that like seduces young men, and he exposes this woman for being basically a vampire at the wedding, and she like flies off. So
That's
like that
awesome.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of it is like retroactive, right? It
Mm-hmm.
comes afterward, and I think Hypatia was also sort of retroactively like Christianized in later sources, right?
Yeah, she becomes like very similar to Galileo. She becomes this kind of like romanticized as this sort of saint of reason,
Hmm.
and like sort of almost anti Christian or anti religious. kind of figure, as
Right.
like a sort of a martyr for like reason and enlightenment thinking kind of thing. Very much like, so in the tradition of like a figure like Julian,
Yeah.
who's sort of like the last. So while the empire is by and large Christianized, and the emperors have been Christian for a while, and sort of the upper bureaucracy, and so like the Roman world is predominantly Christian. There was one emperor named Julian who was sort of famously like a sort of adherent to sort of not even paganism, but it was like non-Christian like philosophy. And he was
Yeah.
famously like a scholar and a Hellenist, and he was this kind. And he, I think, gets romanticized by later scholarly traditions who kind of in the line of like Edward Gibbon, who very much like pointed the
Yeah.
finger at
Yeah.
Christianity as being integral in the decline and fall of
Right.
Rome,
Right.
and then Julian as this last bastion of sort of like pre-Christian reasoning, which is, I mean, it is a sort of romanticized and is a bit of a projection. I think
Oh yeah.
Hypatia falls into that tradition as well, as like, the what if, like we kind of like people have that like what if kind of thinking, like
Right.
what if blank had never happened, what if Rome had never become Christian and had stayed true to its roots or whatever, like would we be so much, like a kind of like wishful thinking that like, oh, if that had never happened, we would have like landed on the moon 200 years earlier or something like
Yeah, I've
that.
heard that too. That which is kind of a weird, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
weird like redux of like historical fantasy almost. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's because it's kind of that like, because you can never prove or disprove it, and
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
and it's fanciful thinking to think that like, oh, if this had never happened, life would be so much better now, and then it becomes a sort of cudgel to use against whatever it is you don't like.
Exactly. Yeah. And no, I think that this movie even kind of showed that like it doesn't sort of matter which like group you fell in, because there are multiple different communities sort of presented doing terrible things to other people.
Yeah,
And so it's
yeah.
like it doesn't matter like who you are, what you call yourselves. It's like human beings
Mm-hmm.
have had this history of being incredibly terrible to one another for power, and that will always have been the same, right?
If it wasn't Christianity, I think there's a solid argument that the sort of bureaucratic state system of Rome would have become sort of overburdened, and there's all these sort of problems. Like it would have been something else,
Oh
and
yeah.
I don't think it's not like Rome would have like lasted eternal had not
No.
they all converted or whatever. It would have been different, yes, better.
Yeah, no.
But like I think this movie, we were saying like this movie it's not necessarily like championing one side over the other, like in the way that's like Quo Vadis does,
Yes.
or Ben Hur, where
Mm-hmm.
the Christians are made out to be like almost like angelic and saint-like
Right.
and above reproach.
Yeah.
This movie, like there's scenes where like these are sort of based on historical events. Like for example, there's attacks against Jews in Alexandria, and then they lay a trap where they pretend that the church is on fire, and all the Christians rush into the church to put out the fire, and then they're locked inside, and then they're pelted with rocks until they die. And that is in itself retaliation for these Christian sort of fundamentalists, the Parabolani, who go to a theater on the Sabbath and stone Jews who are at the theater, and so they have this retaliation, and then that leads to a worse of retaliation where that just breaks out into sort of mob violence and massacres in the streets, and the sort of anti-Semitic violence that was promoted by Cyril, who did call for this kind of violence and the banishment of Jews from Alexandria.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this kind of, this like sectarian violence that sweeps over Alexandria.
For sure. Yeah, like that is totally historically accurate. Like that absolutely happened.
And there's another element the movie doesn't get into, which I think because it probably can't, but even within the church itself, within Christianity, Cyril sort of was running afoul of other religious figures. There was all sorts of like strife, different sort of theological approaches that resulted in violence, and like all the historically there's a lot of contention between religious figures in like particularly between Rome and Carthage, different sort of doctrines and creeds that resulted in violence against one another, and it's the whole thing is wild and a mess and has no relationship to anything going on in the modern world.
Yeah, well, I feel like we don't like normally get to see that kind of mob violence in an ancient movie, very like specifically about religious street politics, I guess you would
Yeah.
call it.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was actually really interesting, and it was, I feel like, kind of brave of this movie to try to attack that and actually represent a lot of
Mm-hmm.
conflicting and extremely complicated ancient, time in the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I forget where we started on this.
I don't. We were talking about Hypatia, I think, and then we kind of veered off. We followed the ellipses around. I want to
Yeah.
say just one little observation.
Okay.
So when they were talking, because this was me patting myself on the back for being smarter than the movie, not really, or being smarter than the characters in a movie, because they're having that conversation while they're in the. It's like, because they frame it as while they're all besieged. And Hypatia is still thinking about like different Earth models, and they're like, "But what about Aristarchus, who's like the center?" And then they're like, "Well, there's problems with that." But like, and then somebody basically says like, "Well, if the Earth is moving, why do we not just like fly off it?" And I out loud I said, "Well, it's like inertia, but like you could like say you were on like a boat or a carriage, and you like threw up like a stone, it would fall back in the carriage or the stone with you because it's moving at the same rate as you." Because I took physics in 8th grade,
Sure, exactly.
or science, or I have a high school level education of science, and then lo and behold, like 3 scenes later, she's on a boat and she drops a sack, and it's like the sack lands where it was dropped, and now I'm like discovering inertia. I'm like, yes, I'm like, I would have killed it in Alexandria.
So
I would have been so smart.
This is the thing that you would take back with you in time to to make everybody's life better.
Let's take a sharp detour here for our listeners, because I want them to hear this, and I want them to think about it. Because a question that I sometimes posit friends over drinks is like, say you were thrown back in time, and with all of the like a la like a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court style, like you were put back in time, you have all your like future knowledge, whatever, but you're in the sort of the technology of the time that you're in. Like, say you're in ancient Rome, so like you could describe a phone to someone, but like you couldn't make a phone, right? Like that's just impossible. But like, what could you bring back? What like future knowledge could you use to like help you live?
There have been some great answers to this conversation, and I think paper was one that we talked about, because for the longest time it's like you had vellum, which is like animal skin basically, or papyrus, which is a certain type of paper, but it only comes from a certain plant, so it's really expensive. So I would totally make paper way earlier, at least in the Mediterranean. I think like farther east, like China, they were making paper way ahead of everybody else.
They might have been already on it.
Oh yeah.
My answer that I settled on was, I'm like fairly confident that I could create like a flushing toilet.
I love that answer.
I've done enough work. I've recently, well, not recently, but a few months ago, I replaced my toilet, and I'm like fairly confident that I understand of like the logic of a toilet, which is like a pretty low tech device, all things said and done.
Yeah, and I mean the Romans had running water, so if you have running water, basically you can create a flushing toilet.
I feel like I could make one out of like terracotta. I feel like someone like Adam's gonna listen to this and be like, no, you don't. No, you couldn't.
No, you couldn't.
But yeah, I feel like I could manage something like a flushing toilet. I thought of something else on that note. It was maybe, I'm trying to remember. Oh, maybe I was thinking like, maybe could I invent like a bicycle or something like that?
Ooh, but like, maybe. Yeah.
But then I think the problem is, a bicycle, you kind of need like you need like smooth roads for that to work, I think. Like, yeah. Like, I don't think I could make a mountain bike, because you don't have like rubber or anything. It would have to be made out of like wood and leather.
Yeah, and that would be kind of hard to...
And the chain would be tricky.
I mean, you could probably get a pretty small chain. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You'd have to make the like gears, I guess, though.
Yeah.
Which
that would be tough too, I think.
Yeah.
I keep coming back to toilet, or I think like various, like the other thing I think about is like various like culinary things. Like I bet you could invent like pasta. Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's like pretty straightforward for sure. Mm-hmm. And again, like, yeah, other people in the world during ancient Rome have already been making pasta, but yeah, that's not in Italy yet.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like, yeah, this is specific, I think, to if we were, say, put back in ancient Italy, as opposed to like North America or something.
Yeah.
If I were put into first century Texas, I don't know what I would be up to.
Yeah, I don't know.
But yeah, readers and Twitter people would like posit this question: if you were thrown back in time, what sort of future knowledge could you bring that would like give you an edge?
I love it.
I don't have a good pivot, but I have another thing to say.
Okay.
But I want to talk about, because the other, maybe the main character, because you mentioned how Hypatia is like sort of the main character, but not the main character.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other kind of main character is Davis.
Definitely.
Played by Max Mingala?
Mignola, I think.
Mignola, yeah. I'm going to edit that part out where I say his name wrong. He, I think, is if I could change one, like we speak, and here's the pivot.
Okay.
Instead of bringing one thing back in time with you, if you could change one thing about this movie, what would you change? And I think for me, I would change the character of Davis.
Okay, to what?
Okay. So here's my problem with Davis is that he's kind of like an audience surrogate where he just sort of witnesses and feels conflicted, but he doesn't really have much to do. He's a very sort of passive character, which makes him, I think, a bad lead character. Whereas Hypatia is a much more active character who is like actually changing things and has influence, limited albeit, but has some sort of agency. Whereas Davis, also there's certain things I think like that Davis does that just estrange him to me and I think other audience members. Like he's kind of a obsessive little weirdo.
Well, I feel like I never really knew his motivation for anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, it's established from the beginning that he is like in love with Hypatia and is obviously like following her teachings. He's like there as her attendant in class, but he obviously like learns a lot about like the astronomy that she's teaching and pays attention and is interested in it. But at the same time, he like is obviously he's an enslaved person. So he hates being an enslaved person.
Yeah.
Sort of see him like reacting to like they are told that they can't be Christians and his sort of like, being treated terribly by everybody.
But I think that's why he goes over to Christianity because they give him an alternative to his very oppressed lifestyle.
Yeah.
And we have that scene of Theon, Hypatia's father, who's kind of berating and abusing his slaves for being Christians and just like the oppression that he experiences on like a day-to-day basis, and the fact that he's like at the school but he can't really
he's
participate. And like Hypatia gives him a little bit of like he gets to bring his model and like he's clearly very smart, but he can't pursue his he's confined by the status of his by the nature of his position.
And like in the same breath that Hypatia is like praising his model and what he's saying, she's like, no, like brawling and fighting is for slaves and like blah blah blah. So it's like she can't even treat him like a human being.
And like when they're fleeing the library and she is incredibly distraught because she's like and all the other scholars are like all of these books are in peril. We have to get out as many as we can, and like we taking out the most important, and he's trying to help and she's like, you idiot, like she's like berating him for like don't be so daft. And then that's when he goes over and joins the mob. And like, because there's like the conflict with him is like the pent up animosity and rage he feels sort of at his oppressors versus his when he joins the Christians, he sort of realizes that he kind of regrets parts of his choices because they
are in turn like oppressing others.
And destroying knowledge. Which, when I say it out loud like that, seems like a very interesting conflict. But
it didn't, I don't know, it didn't like track, or I feel like it wasn't built up enough.
He mostly just like, because most of what he does, particularly for the back, like the middle, the back to middle parts of the movie, is he just kind of like sits around and kind of looks conflicted.
And like feels sad, I guess. But then also like kills people.
Yes. Yeah. He's like completely complicit in the sectarian violence that's going on.
And then sort of, I guess the very end, he like makes a sort of like maybe personal decision for himself. Is like, I'm going to be a nice person and like kill Hypatia before they can torture her to death. And
it's kind of mirroring of, there's a very sort of disturbing scene where in the midst of the kind of riots, he goes back to Hypatia's house, and there's a content warning for our listeners, but there's like an attempted rape scene where, which he falls apart. He basically has a breakdown in the middle of, and then she frees him and tells him to get out. And then he comes, and that's sort of reversed a little bit at the end where he effectively grants Hypatia sort of a merciful or a sort of an easier death as opposed to being tortured.
Yeah.
Which is part of like that sort of estranged me to him because I sort of, because Davis makes a lot of, this is a tricky, I think, needle to thread for a movie because like of having a character sort of make bad choices, but keeping the audience on sort of the character's side, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like, I think of a character like Jaime Lannister, who is kind of a very deplorable person
Right.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think, and I don't think I speak just for myself, but like the audience is very invested in Jaime's salvation, so to
Yes.
speak, or his redemption.
Mm-hmm.
And which is part of why I think the finale of Game of Thrones is so disappointing.
Yes.
We need like air horns to go off that this is a 50-minute Trojan horse for me complaining about Game of Thrones. But to bring it back to Davis, like I was not really ever on board with Davis to begin with, and so
yeah,
I was sort of against him for most of the movie.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I sort of didn't, feel like his, fall into violence was all that surprising, considering the terrible way that he'd been treated throughout most of the movie. I was like, yeah, all right, sure.
And maybe we're not supposed to like Davis.
Maybe we're not. That's what I think I did actually like about this movie, is that it did try to sort of create very complex and interwoven identities in this like a very intersectional kind of way, on like where are all of the political, social, and cultural pieces pulling at these characters. And I can imagine that for a slave in the 4th century, Christianity would have been like a huge pull, a huge drive, and then, personal, ties to people that you love versus, maybe an aversion to violence. I don't know. I think all of that is actually very interesting. So I like that this movie tried to do something with that.
And I think he becomes sort of he's like an audience sort of surrogate for like the hypocrisy of kind of a lot of these things of like, on one hand, so that character Ammonius is, like brings him in and says like, oh, like become a Christian, like help this poor starving person, like help give out food, like the charity and humility, which as it is such a sort of driving force behind this religious movement. And I think is responsible largely for its growth and development and also the very active conversion. But then the like sort of hypocrisy later where they're just like, oh, we'll just kill everyone who disagrees with us.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's present in like the same character, because Ammonius is the guy like giving out the bread and saying, like, why do you need money? Like, there are people starving here. Like, let's be helpful. And then he's the one who sort of like starts the big riot at the end and tries to kill Orestes for just like not kneeling in front of the Bible.
Yeah. He's the most sort of violent and like dogmatic. He's the most radicalized of and a real person also who Cyril did try to beatify. But apparently, actually, historically, that ran him afoul of some people.
Ow, poor Ammonius.
I mean, I'm not that sympathetic towards Ammonius.
No. Not at all.
I think another general, like this movie, I think is very attentive to, like we were talking about, like it deviates from and oversimplifies and shuffles around some of the history, which I think any sort of movie is that's completely within their right. But what I did like is the way that this movie, the sort of like cultural, like the like you mentioned intersectionality, but the very sort of multicultural aspect of Alexandria in the 4th and 5th century.
Yeah.
And it's like very complex that there are all these different people. This is a very cosmopolitan city with like layers upon layers of cultural traditions stacked upon each other. Like they're walking around and there's pharaonic art and motifs and architecture all around them, and then there's Greek style temples. I mean, Serapis himself is a sort of partly Greek, partly Egyptian deity.
Yeah.
This sort of, and the religious customs are sort of a mishmash of that kind of thing. And then like, there's also the Romans who are this other presence there.
Yeah.
And Orestes and Sinise, and all these characters who are like sort of Greek. Presumably they would probably be speaking Greek in this movie, or maybe like some form of Egyptian. Yeah, but that I did really appreciate about this movie. This movie seemed really, I think, attentive to.
Yeah, I think this movie actually had what's it called, like a historical
Consultant.
consultant. Yeah, Justin Pollard.
Oh, gee, I don't know. I don't recognize that, but
He's a British historian who does like a lot of stuff for a lot of different movies. I think he did stuff for Elizabeth and Vikings.
mhm.
Yeah, so I mean, it definitely shows that they put a lot of attention into
Mhm.
the just like the geographical and like the space of the city, which I think was really cool. I love that they had like the Christian church with those big pharaonic
Mm.
statues in the back. I'm like, that's exactly what it looks like.
That's the most like that's like so I feel like we could do a whole like lecture for undergraduates about that kind of, it's not even syncretism, but like the way like religious sort of spaces get co-opted.
Yes. Yeah.
Like I'm thinking of, this is a different time in a different context, but there's a really great example in Rome where I think there are these three temples, and I think it's right by the Forum Boarium, kind of near the river. If you go to Rome today, and there's a church. The church is still standing. I'm not sure how old that church is, and I don't remember its name. But there's a church you go into, and the center sort of colonnade in the church, like there's the aisle, and then where all the pews and stuff are. That center colonnade is from one, I think originally Republican, but probably those columns are much later. There's like one Roman temple that forms the center colonnade. And then the outer walls of the church are two different colonnades from two other temples that would have been like, if you went back into, say, first century Rome, there would have been three temples basically right in a row.
Which is so cool.
And then they built this church. So basically the outer walls of the walls of like these two outside temples become the walls of the church, and then the inner colonnade of the center temple becomes the sort of aisle of the church.
I love it. It's so cool. Yeah, no, there's the cathedral in Syracuse has a temple of Athena just like in the walls. You see the pillars in the walls of the church. And I think the temple of like the Divine Augustus somewhere in Turkey like is now a mosque. There used to be a mosque right in the Parthenon, I think. There used to be
the Parthenon was a temple to Athena and a mosque and a church.
Yeah. Oh, and there's some also in Rome. There's some church that if you go to the basement, there's like a Mithraeum, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is it's
or even like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. You know, was church, now it's a mosque. But yeah, like that like they would absolutely take like an old pharaonic temple or whatever, Greek temple or whatever it was, and then put a cross in it and maybe make some architectural changes.
Yeah, put some Kairos up here and there.
There's a great shot that I made a note of. I think it's when there's Orestes. I think it's Orestes and Cyril, and they're talking to one another, and they're sort of standing. I'm making a picture with my hands, but they're sort of standing across from each other, and they're framed by these two pharaonic sculptures who are looking at each other sort of opposite.
It's really
and then
cool.
they're sort of the whole scene is like framed by these two statues looking at one another. Like that's Alejandro Amenabar. I think as a director, like he knows what's up.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's, I think, also really, wonderful shots of like panning over the city and seeing like when all like violence is breaking out, you see the people running around and like these like sweeping shots over the Serapeon, like the people are fleeing and other people are sort of scurrying into the buildings.
Yeah, those were cool. I didn't know how to feel about like the I guess space shots where it's like the Earth from space.
I'm so happy you brought this up because I made a note. I don't know if you said there's a great joke where it's like a Buzz Aldrin was like, so the joke is like, well, so Buzz Aldrin says like, you know, when you look down on Earth from the moon and you see just this like blue marble and you think about all the differences in like race and religion and creed and ethnicity sort of fall away, and you realize that they're all just a bunch of losers who have never been to the moon. That's all I can think of.
Yep.
But I think like that's kind of, I think the idea is like to frame it in a cosmic, because the idea is like Hypatia's concerns transcend whatever petty sectarian issue that's happening on the streets.
Exactly.
Like she's trying to answer questions about like the world and its place in the universe, which I feel like Neil deGrasse Tyson somewhere is like, it has like, she goes like, he's like, ooh, yes. Cause he's like, this is all so much more important than whatever the these people are
Yeah,
fighting
yeah, yeah,
over.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Okay, I like it from that perspective because I think watching it, I was like, why? What? Really?
I think it's kind of a condescending stance to take, but like,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Maybe a little
maybe
ham-fisted.
trivial.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know. I don't know.
but yeah, I mean, I think I like my take is like everyone is just a loser who hasn't been to space. Um, we're hitting sort of the end of our and this real whirlwind tour of this movie. Um,
It tried to pack a lot into those 2 hours.
it was a dense two
It
hours, I
really
will say.
was. Yeah.
But the only other part I kind of really wanted to talk about, I mentioned how I love Rachel Weisz, and she can do no wrong.
Accurate.
But I'm
Accurate.
also maligning my other main man, Oscar Isaac, who can do no wrong in my eyes, and I'm here for pretty much every. I think Oscar Isaac is one of those actors that no, however good or bad the movie is around him, he's always great.
I agree. Yes. And I just especially love him in Ex Machina. And that's like
Yes,
always my fallback Oscar Isaac role, which I love.
he has such to me has such like a he's like a very he's a surprisingly versatile.
Yes.
So this movie is I think he's by this point he's an unknown. I think he's maybe been the skeevy Prince John in Ridley Scott's Robin Hood, and
That was him?
yeah, oh yeah, no, that was him
Oh my god.
before I think he blew up, and then Ex Machina, he's about 5 years out from Ex Machina. That's in 2014. Inside Llewyn Davis, when he does with the Coen brothers,
Yeah.
that's 2013. Because it seems like this, the Orestes character is interesting to me because at first he seems like really sort of slimy almost. Like I think that he's going to be some kind of like. At first, I thought he was going to be like this obstacle boyfriend. He's this
Yeah.
like pretentious, skeevy, rich kid.
Mm-hmm.
And then he really pivots in the later half of the movie and becomes like a great friend and ally to Hypatia,
Mm-hmm.
which is I don't know, maybe it's a little strange, but I mean, I guess there's an arc going on that we only see a little bit of, where he goes from like a pretentious, spoiled rich boy
Yeah.
to a sort of somewhat thoughtful and responsible leader.
Well, yeah, because he like tries to sort of bring her teachings, the
Mm-hmm.
more unites us than divides us, like into his being the prefect. So I was
Yeah.
surprised. I was like, oh, he's good now.
But what I like about it is like because he does that kind of skeeviness so well, or like an Ex Machina where he's this really kind of like makes your
Oh
skin
yeah,
crawl
he
a
really
little bit.
does. It's like no.
Or in Sucker Punch. I think that
Yeah.
was another one of his like
Yeah.
kind of where people were like, keep an eye on this guy because
Yep.
he like that movie. I think is like not good,
Oh
but I
no,
think he really like when he's on the screen, you're like kind of drawn to him.
for sure. Yes.
And then later he's going to be Poe Dameron, and like where he's the most charming person ever.
Yeah,
Which I
and
was like again very surprised by that I could he could be so like I don't know ebullient, is that the word I want to yeah, ebullient, that's a good word.
and I'm just like looking at his IMDb now. I forgot that he was in Annihilation actually, but that
Oh, it's because he was Apocalypse.
yeah.
Oh no, Annihilation. No, I'm sorry, X-Men. Never mind. Annihilation with Natalie Portman.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. He's the
He's the
boy.
husband,
Yeah,
boyfriend.
I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess he's not in there like a whole lot, but I do. Yeah, he was there. Yeah, no, I agree. Absolute gold. Love him.
Because I feel like his Rachel Weisz. I mean, Rachel Weisz has had steady work basically for the last like 20 years.
Yeah.
And she's gonna be in the Black Widow movie.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah, she's like one of the Russian handlers. But I feel like I hadn't seen her in a major because it seems like she was increasingly taking like smaller projects or sort of like I'd see her every now and then, but in like a lower budget or like maybe not as big of a movie.
Right.
I mean, I'm thinking really of like also like The Mummy to me is. I know you have feelings about The Mummy.
I do, and I love The Mummy. I can't not love The Mummy. I have too much nostalgia in my soul.
Yeah.
But
But like this is like Rachel Weisz is kind of her career is sort of hit this sort of line.
well, I'm thinking about like The Favorite. That was
Oh, that's right.
huge.
Maybe I'm just I don't watch enough Rachel Weisz movies.
Maybe
I gotta remedy that.
The Favorite was great, but
This is like Oscar Isaac. I think like pre his
yes,
sort of
for
this
sure.
Is, yeah, like he's 5 years out from like blowing up.
Yeah, I mean Max Minghella has also been in a lot more things now. He was in *Handmaid's Tale*.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
he also, there was an interesting, like, they do an interesting transformation with him because, or just because, like, in the beginning he seems like a child. Like, I think he just has a very like youthful
He
face. He
does,
looks
for
very
sure.
very young.
Yeah.
And then they give him the beard later too.
Yeah, I guess.
And like we could split hairs and say like Hypatia maybe at the end of her life was probably in her like 50s or 60s, but like whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know, how old is Rachel Weisz? Oh, she's 51.
Okay, so she was not that old when the movie. So, I don't know.
Yeah, she was like in her 40s.
Yeah, well, that's fine.
Or like late 30s, early 40s.
Yeah.
She was born in 1970, so she would have been 39.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, any nitpicks or gripes? Fun facts?
I don't think I do have any.
I only have one, and it was real petty.
I can't wait.
So we mentioned, like, I think this movie actually is quite good about its attention to detail is
For sure.
pretty good.
Yeah.
But there's a scene where it's when they're trying to rescue all the scrolls from the library or the Serapeon, and they're running around, and then they have they kind of, the shot is framed where it's like the section of the library where they're at, and so they have like to drama, but it's like written in Greek. So they have drama, and then they have hysteria, and it's spelled wrong, basically.
Oh no.
You know what I'm talking about?
I do now. Yep.
Yeah, because it's spelled with
an eta?
Basically, they put an eta in front of it, which is a letter in ancient Greek that probably made like an E sound or an A sound. They basically put an unnecessary letter in front of the word hysteria to like make us, so we know. The reason they did this is so we can look at it and like, oh, it says history, because the Greek letters are just similar enough that like we can figure it out.
Yeah. But
they put that H in front of it to like to cue us in, even though it's actually would not have been spelled that way. That was my only. I think it's light years better than like whatever is going on in Percy Jackson.
Yes, accurate. Yeah, I like this movie 10 times more than I liked Percy Jackson. Yeah. No, I think people do nitpick about the costumes, say that everything's a little bit anachronistic, sort of shoved together. Mm-hmm. But like, I don't know, nothing was like really distracting to me. Like I wasn't, I think it all meshed very well.
And then like we sort of complain or talk or gripe or whatever it is we do about like, any ancient movie where you have like they just throw together any and all Greek art into like the same scene.
Yeah.
Because it's like basically recognizable.
Yeah.
Like the kind of like, what's it called? Like our like cultural sort of like the amalgamation of like ancient Greece and then like into these like a couple of different iconographic or aesthetic things and then just sort of putting it all in there together. But
yeah, more people should watch this movie is my takeaway.
I think that's really, I think they just, it's like, it's not an amazing movie.
No.
I think the real litmus test is I also, the other day I rewatched Moana. But like I didn't cry in this movie in the same way that I cry when I watch Moana.
Nice. Yes. Okay.
So it's not as good as Moana.
I watched for the very first time, don't laugh at me, Silence of the Lambs.
Oh.
I know. Yes, exactly that. And I have never felt like more tension in a movie.
Yeah.
And so everything else more recently has felt like, oh, I'm not like clutching all of my, arms and like my fingers aren't digging into my palms. So
my whole body is not one huge clench.
Yeah, exactly.
My mood is clench.
Yeah. But no, I think more people should see this. It's interesting.
Yeah. And it's on Amazon. It's like not terribly hard to find. Mm-hmm. We spoiled pretty much all of the movie.
Yep.
But again, much like the Titanic, you know where it's going.
You do, yeah.
Or you can. I mean, just a quick Google. Yeah, so watch Agora. Oh, I take back what I said about the one thing I would change about this movie.
Oh, no.
And in lieu of changing Davis, I would still change the title of this movie.
Yes, I would also still change the title of this movie. Maybe just to be like, I think Alexandria would be a good title. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's true. So for those who listen, I don't check the mail, but right back. Maybe we should put this question up on Twitter, which is the first is what ancient future knowledge would you bring back with you if you could?
Hell yeah.
2, if you were to rename this movie, what would you rename it to?
Yes.
Because my leads were still either Hypatia or Alexandria. Alexandria, I think, is probably just sounds cooler.
Yeah.
On that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's more truthful because it's sort of like, I don't think Hypatia is like the main character. So yeah, I think like
Mm-hmm.
Alexandria, it's sort of this city going through this turbulent time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it like well, like the city where it's like the city is really the fourth character of the movie?
It is though. It really
You know,
is.
like how many movies where like New York is also kind of a
Yeah,
character?
exactly. Exactly that.
So yeah, so we should take that as our cue. My cat is screaming at me. I don't know if
Okay.
the mic's picking it up,
Well.
but we should take that as a cue. So next week we're on for Pompeii,
Yes,
right?
we are. That's gonna be
I'm gonna have to get more wine.
yeah.
So we're gonna do Pompeii with a guest with Christy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christy Shermer. And in lieu of that, yeah, as always, you can find us on Twitter at Dig Movies. You can listen to us on Apple and Spotify and Stitcher and Amazon now, on Google Podcasts. And so like, review, subscribe, follow, all that good stuff. And I think we will sign off.
Woohoo.
So bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Yeah. Leo, all right, Leo, make a decision, bud. Like, are you going to snuggle? Or are you gonna go outside? Because the door's open.
Make up your mind.